Hi everyone, this is my presentation on the case study. So here are some facts of the case. The end of the school year is near and annual teacher evaluations are due. Mrs. Stevens is being evaluated by her principal, who was initially very pleased when he hired her. So Mrs. Stevens, who was very intelligent and she has an excellent background in her subject matter. After her principal visited Mrs. Stevens' classroom, it was very clear that she was having difficulties managing her classroom and she didn't really know how to motivate her students. So the principal observed students showing very little respect for Mrs. Stevens. So after the classroom observation, the principal scheduled a post-conference with Mrs. Stevens. During the post-conference, Mrs. Stevens was very irritable, hostile to suggestions, and she was very difficult to communicate with. She became very defensive when the principal suggested that she might want to try to involve her students more in the classroom lessons. So the principal was discouraged by Mrs. Stevens' intractability and brought the meeting to an end. He later reflected on the conference and wondered whether it would really be worth it to continue working with her. So he then decided to visit a classroom again one more time before submitting his evaluation to his supervisor to recommend Mrs. Stevens for another year to be rehired. When he did visit the classroom again, there was no improvement. So since the principal didn't want to be stuck with her for another year, he decided not to renew her contract. So the principal scheduled another meeting with Mrs. Stevens to discuss the evaluation and to also kind of let her know that her contract will not be renewed. So Mrs. Stevens became very angry at the meeting, and she told the principal that her scores are inaccurate and very unfair. So Mrs. Stevens also stated that the principal was unsupportive and he did not offer any practical ideas on how to improve. So neither did her direct supervisor. So therefore, Mrs. Stevens walked out of the principal's office and she told him that she intended to fight for a fair evaluation and she's planning on suing the district. So some of the summary of the case, so people who were involved are the principal, Mrs. Stevens supervisor, the superintendent of school, board members, and assuming that the school has a union, perhaps a union rep and then lawyers. Where did this happen? So I'm assuming that it's a high school setting, grades 9 to 12, but we're not really sure since there are some details missing. Since this is also an end of year evaluation, I'm guessing that it happened like in the spring semester. Legal and ethical issues. No one has been physically harmed. However, Mrs. Stevens is very angry and she's hurt because her contract was not renewed. And was the evaluation protocol followed? Mrs. Stevens was a non-tenured teacher, and this was her tenured year. So it's like, how long has she been working there? We don't really know. What are the laws and regulations behind teacher evaluations? We don't really know either. None of that either. A lot of legal and ethical issues in this case. Mrs. Stevens is entitled to a fair evaluation process. A lot of information and details are missing from this case. Since this was Mrs. Stevens' tenured year, we know that there are evaluations from previous year that we haven't seen. Where are they? Is this the first time Mrs. Stevens received a bad evaluation? Was there any actionable feedback from previous, evaluations that were provided to Mrs. Stevens? Was she ever placed on an action plan? Is there a teachers' union? Were they contacted? Did someone contact a union rep? Did the principal potentially breach the teacher's contract? So there's a lot of unanswered questions there. It can be very difficult to prove that a teacher is ineffective during her tenured year, especially if she was never provided with prior actionable feedback from past evaluations. Also, did the district provide Mrs. Stevens with professional development opportunities to help her succeed? So I feel like there are a lot of unanswered questions. So just to kind of synthesize the case, during her annual review meeting, Mrs. Stevens was told by her principal that her contract for the following school year would not be renewed. Therefore, she is seeking legal actions against the school district. Kind of to synthesize the fact, the people who are involved: principal, Mrs. Stevens' students, Mrs. Stevens' direct supervisor, superintendent, legal counsels from both sides, place. It happens in a school district in some sort of an educational setting. We're not sure that it is a high school or middle school. The evaluations took place in Mrs. Stevens' classroom. Some of the unknown facts: is it a private or public school? Is it a middle of a high school? What subject did Mrs. Stevens teach? How long has she been teaching? We know it's her tenured year. How many years has she been in that specific district? Who's a direct supervisor? What is the demographic of the school? How many students are in her class? Is there a teachers union in the school? Is there a teacher's contract? What are states and local requirements for teacher evaluations? Who evaluated Mrs. Stevens previously? Does this district provide teacher evaluation? Does the district provide teachers with professional development opportunities? So again, these are all facts that we don't know much about, so it's really hard to come up with a conclusion in this case. Review and prioritize information. There is not enough information really to come up with a conclusion. As far as I know, all relevant stakeholders have not yet been contacted. What were the ratings and result from Mrs. Stevens' previous evaluation? The teacher evaluation form that it was, provided to her was very poor. There was not much information in that form. There were no areas of growth in the evaluation form. If there was concern in previous years, then there should have been a corrective action plan for Mrs. Stevens. Mrs. Stevens' direct, supervisor, should have scheduled meetings with her and provided her with actionable feedback and items that she should be working on. And also, the relationship between Mrs. Stevens and the principal is also now strained as well. Mrs. Stevens will probably sue the school district since her contract will not be renewed. This conflict could be damaging to the school district and stakeholders. How many years has Mrs. Stevens been employed in the district? How were her previous evaluation handled? Who handled those evaluations previously? Was the evaluation protocol followed? Potential lawsuit, over a lack of support and professional development and training. And this could be very, very damaging to the community. So here are some options that I came up with. Option 1, you could do nothing and proceed with the decision to not renew Mrs. Stevens' contract. Option 2, you could work with Mrs. Stevens and Mrs. Stevens' direct supervisor to create an action plan for her to improve. Number 3, you can set up a meeting with Mrs. Stevens' direct supervisor to review all of her evaluation and feedback from previous years, as well as the school board policy on teacher evaluation. So once you review all of those things, then you can inform Mrs. Stevens that you are willing to give her another opportunity to improve her teaching practices. So you can go back to the classroom for another evaluation. So this time you want to meet with Mrs. Stevens for a pre-observation conference to kind of discuss the goals and the objectives of the lesson that will be observed. You can provide her with copies of the rubric prior to the observation so she can know what the rubric looks like, so that way Mrs. Stevens is clearly knowledgeable and capable, so she just really needs more support. Options. So some of the possible consequences to each options. So with the first options, pros and cons, is you're not having to deal with Mrs. Stevens the following year, so it's an easy decision. So the cons, you will run the risk of getting sued by Mrs. Stevens. So this is also show that there is a lack of support for teachers. Option 2, it will give Mrs. Stevens an opportunity to kind of improve on her teaching skills and also classroom management skills, since you know that those are the areas that she lacks in. And then some of the cons to that is she could still be angry into the district, and she could refuse the guidance, and she might not improve at all, and she will still sue the district, obviously. The third option, which I think probably is the best option, so this option will hopefully kind of motivate Mrs. Stevens to want to improve on her classroom management skill, and she could still put up a fight and create more legal issues for the district, but it can also take a few months to see improvement from her side. And she also might not want to improve at all, and and you can run the risk of getting stuck with her as a tenured teacher, and she might just be unteachable. I mean, who knows, right? So you got to take a risk either way. Choose the best option. I think the best option is a combination of 2 and 3. It is very clear that laws were broken in this case. So as previously mentioned, there is not enough information to come up with a conclusion. So with all of those options, Mrs. Stevens can still be upset and resistant. So by placing her on an action plan, it will either force her to quit or it will force her to become more creative in the classroom and improve on her teaching skills and classroom management skills. I also think that providing her with a teacher mentor could be beneficial to her as well. In her eyes, she was not getting the support that she needed from her direct supervisor or the principal. Therefore, she became very defensive. So I think she's very smart and she knows the content. So she just needs better classroom management skills. Implementing the decision, the first step is to contact the superintendent and explain what happened. Let the superintendent know what Mrs. Stevens is planning, that she's planning on suing the district, and we will need that legal counsel representation. Reevaluate the situation, make sure that all the documents are presented. Meet with Mrs. Stevens' direct supervisor to create an action plan for her to improve. Set up a meeting with Mrs. Stevens, her direct supervisor, and the superintendent to discuss what the next steps are in the evaluation process. As a principal, make sure to review areas of growth with Mrs. Stevens and actionable items that she should be working on. Being visible is important. Providing actionable feedback is important. Make sure that evaluation protocol is being followed. Make sure as a principal you follow the outline in the teacher's contract. And as a principal, go back and take a look at all the previous feedback from Mrs. Stevens' evaluations. As a principal, you should pop into Mrs. Stevens' classroom, do a walkthrough, and send Mrs. Stevens an email just to ask her, to chat and giving her actionable feedback. Evaluation is all about mentorship and retention of staff. You want to create an environment where people want to stay in your school and build relationships. It's important, to recognize that education, what education is supposed to be open and be open-minded and have a growth mindset. If the plan doesn't work, then Mrs. Stevens will end up suing the district. In conclusion, I think this was a great example of a teacher evaluation that went wrong in the direction. It kind of went into the wrong direction. So I learned that it's important to stay consistent, document everything, and provide actionable feedback at all times. As a future building leader, it will be important for me to know all of the laws and regulations behind teacher evaluation. It's important to know what your school board policies are when it comes to teacher evaluations. Make sure that the district policies are aligned with the state policies. The school district and principal should always review and assess the evaluation rubric and make it available to all teachers and staff before the evaluation process. As educators, we know that professional learning contributes to teacher improvement and raise student achievement. So therefore, providing teachers access to professional development and actionable feedback is critical to their success as an educator. Thank you so much for listening. Here's my references. It was great learning from everyone in this class.